I'm going to do my best and just let the Lord lead. And I want to address the behavior of a kingless people. The behavior of a kingless people. Earlier this week, a tragic end occurred for a man named Troy Davis. Some of you may know of his name at least because of his story. Troy Davis was an inmate in a Georgia facility who for the last 20 years was fighting to clear his name. He had been accused and convicted of murdering a police officer 20 years ago. The unfortunate thing was that he maintained even until his last days that he was innocent. What makes it worse is that 9 people who originally called themselves eyewitnesses to this murder, 7 of them recanted their statements, producing basically reasonable doubt that this man was rightly convicted. He fought for years just to get one more trial. And all of us who know anything about the law, even the smallest amount about the law, he should have been entitled because of at least new evidence and the recanting of most of the testimony. He should have at least been given one more chance. I'm not here to talk about the death penalty. I'm not even here to try to claim I know whether he was truly innocent or guilty. But the commentary now that has come about is something that has been, at least the attempt of it, has tried to infiltrate our society. A lot of people are trying to hide behind the idea that we are so evolved as a people now that in 2011, the intelligent, ignorant people have decided that we are now in a post-racial society. Church, that is not true. People have come to a conclusion that we should trust the government alone to fix our issues and problems. And as we have discovered, or if we did not already know, the government can fix all the problems that we have. And to go even further with that, the division within our government has become such that it reminds me of a story I will highlight in a moment about Solomon standing up as king, having to judge on the validity of who was the mother of the child. We have people now that are willing to sacrifice at least the ideal of a more perfect union for the cause of their own selfish wants and needs. We live in a society that suggests that if we do better, if we dress better, if we attain more things, if we have more toys by the time we die, we will have shown people that we were a success. We live in a time that is not uncommon to the biblical writ because all we are doing is much like Israel walking and running in circles. You see, the book of Judges is the one book that highlights the cycles of Israel. It was the same old thing. They went into captivity because of sin. They pouted and pleaded with God to get them out. And God would set up a judge, somebody to lead them out of the bondage they were in. They would be delivered and experience God as the deliverer. But after a while, they go right back to square one. And it happened over and over and over again. Even to the point we come to the 21st chapter of this book, and we find, if you go back one chapter before, chapter 20, that now the tribes were up against one another. The last straw of any nation is when its people decide to buck up against one another. When unity can't be found, when we decide that it's no more time to be with certain kind of folk, God just allowed his people to wrestle with one another. But this one verse troubles me. One verse. I've heard it preached 20 million different ways, but it still bothers me. Because it wasn't that long ago that Joshua stood, looked out among the people, and said, choose this day who you're going to serve. Whether it's your God or the God of others. And before he allowed the people to answer, he said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But the people chimed in and said, we also will serve the Lord. They struck a covenant that day that years later they would not keep. When we get to the end of Judges, it simply says, and there was no king. And they did what was right in their own eyes. Last week, we heard Dr. Booth stand in this same place and talk about you ought to be able to what? See the King. You ought to be able to see God clearly. When you come to worship, when you go and have an encounter, when you decide that you're going to worship, whether it's here or at home or whatever, you ought to have the intent on seeing the King. Now, this text doesn't say that King is God. The king is a little king. In other words, it's referring to somebody that has some kind of oversight that can lead the people to the place where they need to be. Now, how can you have someone of that nature unless God has ordained it so? Now, let me take it a step further. God never intended for Israel to have a physical king. His intent was to rule as a theocracy. In other words, a God government, where all he had to do was dispense his vision to those that would carry it out, and they would always go back to him. He was to be the only king of the nation of Israel. So not only did they not have a king in the earth, but because of their actions and the way that they functioned, they rejected God as king. What do you do when you have rejected the one that is the ruler over everything? What do you do when you live in a society where people don't acknowledge God for who he is? What do you do? As a child of the living God, when others look at you and say, you must be crazy for serving God in times like these. You ought to be able to say, I will still what? Lift up my eyes to the hills. Yes. From which cometh my help. All my help comes from the Lord. It doesn't come from a fragmented government. It doesn't come from a place where I gotta hire people and vote people in to try to do what I tell them, and